In this video, I'm mixing it up a little bit. I'm going to be talking about the art process, talk about some of my techniques, and just kind of have a bit more of a chilled out episode. My horror story videos are still coming. I'll be uploading a new one every Friday, nothing's changing. But in this video, I wanted to go back in time. Back to a time where you could upload a drawing video and a regular commentary on top. Not having to do some crazy 100-hour challenge, drawing upside down underwater blindfolded with your arm cut off. No, just a regular drawing and a boring commentary. So that's what I'm doing this week. Enjoy. I know a bunch of my viewers are aspiring artists and enjoy drawing, so hopefully I can share some of my knowledge, I guess. I'm no expert, I'm not really a teacher, that's why in this video I don't really want it to be a step-by-step tutorial, because I didn't really learn how to draw that way. I just watched people and then practiced a lot. So hopefully I can just share some techniques that I learnt that might be able to help you out. But if you want a step-by-step tutorial guide, this isn't the place for that. I just will be rambling a little bit and I'll try to talk about the drawing process. So I found Billie Eilish is a really interesting character. I'm speaking like she's not a real person, but just her look is really kind of out there. She reminds me of like a manga character or anime character. That fit perfectly for me because I enjoy drawing in an anime style. So I wanted to kind of combine the realism and anime together, and this was kind of the result I got. For the line work, I use Copic Multiliners. I generally use the finest one, which is a 0.03, and then I'll thicken up the lines with a 0.05. I just like having the option to get really fine lines and then be able to thicken them up if I want to. Whereas if you go with a thicker fine liner straight away, sure, you'll save time because you don't need to go over the lines, but you can't really thin the lines once you've done thick lines. Whereas obviously if you go with thin lines first, you can go back in and thicken them where necessary. There are so many different ways to do line work. You can have lots of detail, or you can keep it really minimalistic and do most of the shading and detail work with colours. I generally like to have a lot of detail in my line work. I just get carried away. It takes a long time, but it's got a really distinctive look, and I think that's quite characteristic of my style. I also generally have a thicker outline, like a power line around the edge. It just helps make the character pop from the background, in my opinion. But like art always is, it's up to your own personal taste, so everyone has a different style, and that's cool to just experiment with what you like. When it comes to colouring, I always use Copic Markers. They're really amazing. They are expensive, so be prepared for that, but they really are my favourite alcohol-based markers. Colouring the skin for this piece was interesting and a bit experimental. When I'm doing a regular anime drawing, I don't worry about doing quite this much shading, but because it's more realistic than just a normal anime drawing, I had to try and get a bit more variation in the tones to make it just look more 3D. I didn't want it looking too flat, so that was a bit of a challenge. It's worth noting that I also use Prismacolor pencils, so I go over the Copics, I do kind of a base layer with my Copics, and then I will shade on top of that with my pencils. For skin tones, I generally use the really light E markers, so they're an earthy tone. It's got more of a natural browny tinge to it, but there are heaps of different skin colours you can use. That's why I generally don't tell people what exact colours I use, because I think it's beneficial to experiment for yourself. But for a good starting point, the E000, E00, those ones are really good for skin and is what I generally use. Drawing the black sludge coming out of her eyes was absolutely terrifying. After spending that long shading the skin, I wasn't exactly sure how it was going to turn out. Going over my whole drawing with this black dripping sludge out of her eyes, I had no idea if it was going to work or if I was just about to ruin all the shading I did. But I'm glad I had faith in myself because I really, really like the effect. I went in with a really dark marker, and I think it just added an awesome contrast to the piece, and is probably my favourite part of the whole drawing. Ruining all the smooth shading I just did. Nice. I would recommend experimenting with this technique before doing it on an actual artwork you've spent hours and hours on up until that stage, just to ruin it, so have a practice first. Getting used to using Copics takes a long time, and I really like the inky effects that I can get with them, and that's just from lots of practice. You kind of learn how to manipulate the ink to do some really awesome effects, and it always works really well with the horror style that I do. I generally do the smooth base coats first, and then layer the inky splashing effects on top. It works a lot better that way because by the time you're layering the inky effects, there's already a coating on the paper. So what that means is the ink doesn't really settle into the paper as well, and it naturally can pull and move around. It's a bit hard to explain, but I guess you can imagine it like the paper has already absorbed as much ink as it can, so the ink you're putting on top of that just kind of pulls on top. It will dry, but it doesn't absorb like when you're doing a fresh layer on the paper. That's why I always add the grimy textures at the end, because it's just not going to blend smoothly. That can be a detriment, or you can actually use it to your advantage if you want to create these really cool textured effects. That's why I find it works really well for the horror drawings, but you've got to keep in mind this technique really varies depending on the paper that you're using. I use a bleed-proof marker paper which isn't very absorbent, so the technique works really easily on that. But if you're using some of these really thick papers, you might be able to get really awesome smooth blends, but this effect won't really work on that. So that's something to keep in mind. There's no best paper. It's about using what works for the different situation. So the paper that I use, it can be harder to get smooth blends because of that. It's not very absorbent, so once you do a couple of layers, it becomes really hard to blend anything on top of that. But I've kind of found a way to use that to my advantage for the drawing. If you're curious about the paper or any of the other art supplies that I use, check out the video description. I've got a list down there so you can check out what I use. The drawing's getting there, not too much more to do, but I thought I'd talk a little bit about how I colour hair because I know some people struggle with that, and that's understandable. So the way that I shade hair is I generally choose a couple of different tones. So you'll have your highlight colour, then a medium tone, and then maybe a darker one, and then maybe a couple in between, but I'd focus probably on having around 3 markers for that. I'll go in first with my highlights, and that gives me a way to kind of sketch in where the highlights are going to be. Then I can use my medium tone and kind of blend in between the two. Try and follow the strokes of the hair. Any shading strokes that are going to show up, if you don't get it perfectly smooth, it doesn't really matter because it kind of accentuates what would be the strands of hair. It gives a bit more detail to that. And then kind of blend that in and add the darker tones as well. I also go in with pencils after that. I like doing shading with a black pencil because it just ties it all together and you can really make it pop out a bit more. Another little technique which I really like to do is adding some shading with a purple pencil. I find it adds a lot of interest to the piece. Instead of just having black shadows, you have a little bit of purple in there as well. It just looks awesome in my opinion. I like purple. It works really well for shading, so try it out. Now that the drawing is nearly finished, I'm just adding some of the final details, adding some ink splatters across the whole drawing to kind of tie it together. I decided to make the roses look like they were kind of rotting or dying. I don't know, I just felt like it tied the drawing together, bringing all that ink splatter throughout the whole piece and not just coming from her eyes. I have to say, there can be a fine balance between making something look really cool by doing this and going overboard. That's something you just learn from practice, and the quickest way to learn that is probably by going overboard, and then you won't want to do that again. But learning when to stop can be a really important lesson, and it's definitely not something I think I've fully learned or mastered yet. It can be hard not to get carried away and make your whole drawing look like a messy blob by the end of it. But you'll learn that with practice, so just have fun experimenting. It's no big deal if you go too far in one drawing. I've definitely done that in the past, added way too many highlights, way too many blood splatters, that type of thing. It happens, just learn from it and fix it in the next drawing. I always like to add highlights with a white Signo gel pen. It just adds that final touch to the drawing. Again, it's something I try to restrain myself with now. It's easy to go too far with it, and it doesn't always look good if you do. So I try to restrain myself a little bit, but still get in those highlights to really finish the drawing off nicely. And that's about it for this drawing. Hopefully you enjoyed it. If you did, subscribe, support the video. If you want to see more drawing videos like this, be sure to let me know. If the video does well, I'll make more. If you guys aren't really into this, I won't make them anymore. I'll be back with another horror story video next week. I upload those videos every Friday, so make sure to check them out. I've got some really cool stories I'm excited to share with you guys, so don't miss them, and I will catch you guys in the next drawing video. I'll see you then.